Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about the first Mangalam verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. Before talking about the verse itself, I'll first give a little bit of background to this verse. That is, Murugan had collected together 21 verses that Bhagavan had composed on various occasions. And in July 1928, he requested Bhagavan to use these 40 verses as the basis to compose a work of 40 verses on Mayinilbam, the nature of reality, and Adumavam Tiranam, means to attain it. Murugan has he's expressed this in his in the Payaram he wrote for Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. What he says in the Payaram is, Mayin ilbum adumavam tiranam emiku vium padi Murugan oduha ena poi ulahin kalamaru matral ganaramanan Katurai Tan Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu Uvantu. That means when Murugan asked, so that we may be saved, reveal to us the nature of reality and the means by which to attain it, the noble Ramana, being free from the delusion of the unreal world, joyfully and with certainty composed Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. So accordingly, in answer to that prayer of Murugan, on the 21st of July 1928, Bhagavan began to compose more verses on this subject. And in order to arrange them in a logical order and to form them into a coherent text, he and Murugan would discuss in detail the progress of the work, where gaps needed to be filled, and which of the original 21 verses should be retained and which discarded. In the end, only 3 of the original 21 verses were retained in Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, namely verses 16, 37, and 40. And of these 3, the original verse that became verse 16 was modified by Bhagavan to form the present verse. The other 18 of the original verses, along with 3 new verses he had composed while compiling Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, were not retained because they were not sufficiently germane to a subject. So these 21 verses, discarded verses, were formed into a separate work called Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu Anubandham. And over time, that slowly more verses were added, and it came up to the present 41 verses. That's Anubandham. Whereas most of the verses of Anubandham are verses that Bhagavan translated from Sanskrit or Malayalam, all the verses of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu are his own original compositions. And most of them were composed between the 21st of July and the 8th of August, 1928. On the 8th of August, Murugan and Bhagavan and Murugan considered that Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu was complete. And at that time, it consisted of text or nul of 40 verses in Vemba meter, each comprised of 4 lines, with one maṅgalam verse, benedictory verse, which was a Kurul Vemba, a 2-line Vemba, and which is now the last 2 lines of the first maṅgalam verse. So that was on the 8th of August. However, 3 days later, on the 11th of August, Kavyaganta Ganapati Sastri was informed that Bhagavan had composed a new work, so he asked to see it. And on glancing at it, he asked why the maṅgalam verse was not a 4-line one like all the others. Bhagavan then explained to him that it was actually composed in the same meter, but just a briefer version of it. And that Tirukkural, which is the best known and one of the most highly revered classics of ancient Tamil literature, consists entirely of such Kurul Vembas, because it is particularly suited to expressing aphorisms. However, Kavyaganta persisted, saying that since it is the same meter, it would be better if it consisted of 4 lines like all the other verses. So Bhagavan looked at Murugana, who suggested that the meaning could be made more clear if he were to compose 2 more lines before these 2. And hence Bhagavan composed the first 2 lines of the first Mangalam verse, and therefore thereby transforming it into a 4-line Vemba. Kavyaganta then asked Bhagavan to explain the meaning of these 4 lines, and when he found that they made no direct mention of God, he remarked that a Mangalam verse should praise God or invoke his blessings, and suggested that Bhagavan should therefore compose another verse as the Mangalam instead of this one. Bhagavan replied, however, that was not necessary because this verse was appropriate to the aim and purpose of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, namely to elucidate the nature of reality and the means to attain it. Kavyaganta then read the whole work and found that only one verse mentioned the name of God, namely Mahesan, which is the name of Shiva. So he suggested that would be a more suitable verse to have as the Mangalam. Bhagavan and Murugana then discussed this suggestion and decided that since the existing Mangalam verse explained the practice of self-investigation, Atma-vichara, while the other verse described the practice of complete self-surrender, it would be appropriate to use that as a second Mangalam verse. Therefore, since that left only 39 verses in the main text, Bhagavan composed and added one more verse, namely verse 31. And thus, on the 11th of August, 1928, Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu was complete in its present form. So that's the story, but I mean the context in which Bhagavan composed this. So, as I explained, Bhagavan, when he first composed this Mangalam verse, he first composed just the last 2 lines. So, to understand this verse, it's good to actually begin with the last 2 lines to see how Bhagavan first composed it. The last 2 lines are Ullaporul Ullalevan, Ullate Ullapadi, Ullade Ullal Una. That's basically a Q&A, a question and answer. Bhagavan poses a question and gives an answer. The question he asks is, the question he asked was, Ullaporul Ullalevan Ullal. That means, Ullaporul means the being substance or being substance or existing substance. Evan means who, or it can also mean how. In this context, how is actually a better meaning. It can mean either, but how is the main meaning here, but it can also be taken as who. And Ullal means thinking. It can also mean thinking, it can also mean meditating or investigating. In this context, the main meaning is meditating. So the question is, how to meditate on the Ullaporul, the being substance, the one thing that actually exists, the underlying, the substance in the sense of the reality underlying the appearance of all other things. How to meditate on that, or how to think of that. And then the answer is Ullate, Ullapadi, Ullade, Ullal. That means Ullate means in the heart. Ullapadi means as it is. Ullade means being, or only being. That is, Ulladu means being. Ullade, the A is an intensifier that gives the sense of only or alone. So being alone in the heart as it is, Ullal, is thinking. In the other words, that is meditating. So basically this verse is about Brahma Dhyana, meditating on Brahman, how to meditate on Brahman. So Bhagavan asks the question and then gives the answer. The only way to meditate on Brahman is to be as it is in the heart. So that was the original, the verse as Bhagavan originally composed it. Then when on the as suggested first by Kavyaganta and then backed up by Mudgala, Bhagavan then composed two more lines at the beginning. So the whole verse then reads, Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, Uļḷadu, Uļḷapurul, Uļḷalara, Uļlatei, Uļladal, Ullamenum, Ullapurul, Ullalavan, Ullatei, Ullapadi, Ulladei, Ullal Una. It's a very, very beautiful verse and very skillfully composed, because Bhagavan is playing on the same word ulla. That is, the Tamil verb ul means to be. It's a tenseless verb. Ul means be. Ulla is an adjectival participle that means being or existing, and ulladu means what exists or what is. Ullal also has that is ulla. There's also a separate verb, ullu. Ullu means to think or to meditate or to investigate. So that is what forms the verbal noun ullal, which means thinking or meditating or investigating. So it's very beautifully composed verse, but very, very deep in meaning. So he begins with a question. It's a rhetorical question. Uļḷadu Nāṛpadu, Uļḷadu Uļḷadu. Uļļadu means what is. Uļļadu means if not or except. So Uļļadu Nāṛpadu, Uļļadu means awareness. Uļļadu means being awareness, the awareness that is, the actual awareness, the real awareness. Uļļadu means is it, or does it exist? So the meaning of the well, actually there's several ways we can interpret this sentence, but the main meaning is, if what is were not, would being awareness be? In other words, would there be any real awareness if there wasn't some underlying reality? That's one meaning. Another meaning is, except as Uļļadu, does Uļļadu exist? In other words, this is implying, can the real awareness be other than what is? This is the same meaning that Bhagavan gives in verse, same idea, but Bhagavan expresses in verse 23 of Upadesha Undya. What he says in verse 23 of Upadesha Undya, he uses the same two words, Uļļadu meaning what is, and Unavu meaning awareness. He says, Uļļadu unara, Unavu verin meyin, Uļļadu unavahum undipara, unavei namai ullum undipara. What that means is, because of the non-existence of another awareness, to be aware of what is awareness. In other words, if the awareness that knows what is were other than what is, it would not be, it would be non-existent. So it cannot be, there cannot be any awareness other than what is. So what is itself is awareness. And what is that awareness? in the final sentence, he says, Unave namai ullam, that awareness alone exists as we. In other words, that the real awareness, which is not other than the one thing that actually exists, that is we. So from this, we can understand what Bhagavan is referring to in this verse as Uḻḷadu. He's referring to what we actually are. As he says in Nana, in the 7th paragraph of Nana, he says, Yathatamai Uḻḷadu Atma-sarupamondre. Yathatamai means actually. So what actually, and Ulladu is what actually is, or what actually exists, is only Atma-sarupa, the real nature of ourself. In other words, what we actually are, ourself as we actually are, that alone is what actually exists. So when Bhagavan is not talking here about any other thing, he's talking only about our own reality. So, as I say, the first two meanings of this sentence is that if there weren't that Ulladu, something that actually exists, would there be an existing awareness, a real awareness? So Bhagavan is here asserting that the first meaning Bhagavan is asserting the existence of one fundamental reality, one thing that actually exists, and that is not other than awareness. There's also a third meaning we can give for this, because ulla can also be the infinitive of the verb ullu, which means, as I said, to think. So this can also mean, other than ulladu, is there an awareness to think of it? This meaning is quite appropriate to the later portion of the verse. So all these three meanings are appropriate. So can there be any awareness other than Ulladu to meditate upon it? That's a very, very important meaning. Bhagavan is also, that is, Bhagavan has embedded three different meanings in one sentence. So such is Bhagavan's skill as well, he's a Tamil poet par excellence. And he's Bhagavan, so what more is there to say? Then he, the next sentence is an extension of the original first sentence, Ullaporul, Ullalevan, Ullal. That is, he added more before it to expand the sentence. That is, what he says, the second sentence is Ullaporul, as I explained earlier. Ullaporul means the being substance, the Sat-vastu, we can say. In fact, when Bhagavan translated into Sanskrit, he used the word Sat-vastu, if I remember correctly. Ullaporul, Ullalara, Ullate, Ulladal. That's the first clause. That means since the Ullaporul, the existing substance, the Sat-vastu, exists in the heart, Ullalara, without thought, beyond the range of thought, it implied. Ullalara literally means without thought. Ullamenam, Ullaporul, Ullalevan. Ullamenam means which is called heart. So, and then the rest of the sentence is the same, Ullaporul, Ullalevan. How to meditate on that Ullaporul, which is called the heart, since that Ullaporul exists in the heart without thought. In other words, implying it's beyond the range of thought. No thought can penetrate. Because if we sink deep into the heart is pure being. So in the pure being, there can be no rising to think of anything. And this word, this ullamenam, this also has a double meaning. That is, ullam is a Tamil word but means heart. It also has another meaning. That is, the first person plural form of the verb ul is ullom. That's the usual form of it. Ullom means we are. But there's a literary form of Ullom, which is Ullam. So Ullam also, it means heart. It also means we are. Bhagavan often, in Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu and elsewhere, Bhagavan often uses the word nam. Nam means we. That is, in Tamil, there are two forms of we. There's nam and namgal. Nam is inclusive. So if someone says nam, they're including the person being spoken to. If they say nangal, they're excluding the person being spoken to. So nam is the inclusive form of the first person plural pronoun. Bhagavan often used the word nam. For example, he begins the first verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu by saying, Nam Ulhum Kandalal, because we see the world. Why he uses the word we? If he were to say, because you see the world, it's as if he's talking down to us. So Bhagavan doesn't actually see the world, he's beyond that, but he comes down to our level and says, because we see the world, and that's the starting point. Likewise, in verse 16, for example, he says, Na mandri naledu nadedu. That means, except we, where is time and where is space? There, we is referring to, in verse 1, when he said, because we see the world, there we is referring to ego, because it's only ego that sees the world. But in verse 16, when he says, except we, where is time and where is space, that implies there is no time and space, but only we. We there refers to, not to ego, but to Atma-swarupa, to what we actually are. So Bhagavan often uses we, though he's not referring to many, though it's we is plural in form, he's referring to the one thing that actually exists, namely Atma-swarupa, or the one thing that has risen from Atma-swarupa and sees all this, namely ego. So he's using the plural in a singular sense, but in an inclusive sense. So here, when he describes Ullaporul, when he says Ullamenam, which is called we are, it implies that that Ullaporul is what exists and shines within us as our fundamental awareness of our own being, namely I am. So Ullam, though it literally means we are, it implies I am. So that Ullaporul is that fundamental awareness that is always existing in our heart as I am. So how to meditate on that? Since that I am is not something other than ourselves, it can never become an object of meditation. So we can meditate on it only by being it. So this is the meaning of the verse. Why he emphasizes that meditating on I am is nothing but being I am, is that that also is connected with what he says in Upadesha Undiyya. In verse 26 of Upadesha Undiyya, he says, Tanai iritale tanne aridalam. Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. Tanirendakradal, because oneself is devoid of two. That is, there are not two selves, one self to meditate on another self. That is, because what we actually are is awareness. Awareness knows itself not by any act of knowing, but just by being itself. That is, to know anything other than ourself is an act of knowing. It's a mental activity. Knowing anything other than ourself is a mental activity. But knowing ourself is not a mental activity because we are awareness. And just by being awareness, we know awareness. So it's the nature of self-knowledge is quite unlike any other knowledge. Knowing anything other than ourselves is a doing, an action, whereas knowing ourselves is just a state of being. So since we can know ourselves only by being ourselves, we can investigate ourselves only by being ourselves. That's what he implies here. Before I go on to explain this in more detail, I'd just like to mention that Bhagavan uh, um, this is the only verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu that Bhagavan translated into Sanskrit, and he translated it into Sanskrit in Vemba meter at the request of Lakshman Sharma. If there's time, I'll explain more about that later, but that's a secondary thing. The main thing is this is Bhagavan's Sanskrit translation of this verse, and it's a very exact translation. What he says in this Sanskrit translation is Sadvina Sajnanam Asti Kimu Satyam Vritti Rahitam Hridi Vibhati Ataha Tatridayam Jayati Katam Hridi Tadatma Bhava Stitihi Jnanam Sadvastu Nasyat. So if we break that up into sentences, the first sentence is Sadvina Sajnanam Asti Kimu. That is, without Sat, without something that actually exists, could Sat Jnanam exist? Could there be an awareness? Here, Jnanam, we have to understand in the sense of, we can take it as knowledge, but it's better to understand it, knowledge in the sense of awareness. Could there be awareness of being without something that actually exists? So that's a very exact translation of the first sentence of the Tamil verse, but it doesn't have all the different shades of meaning that the Tamil verse has, but it's conveying the main meaning. Without Sat, could there be Satjnana? Could there be, in other words, without Sat, could there be any awareness of Sat? And then he says in the next sentence, I think this is actually what is one sentence in Tamil. I think in Sanskrit it's two sentences. I'm not very, my knowledge of Sanskrit is fairly limited. So maybe ataha can be taken as linking the two parts as one sentence. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, if we take it as two sentences, Satyam Vritti Rahitam Hridi Vibhati. That means the reality shines in the heart, free of thought. Ataha, therefore, Tatridiyam Jayati Katam. Therefore, how to meditate on it, the heart. Tat means it, that satyam, that reality. And how to meditate on it. That reality is the heart. In Tamil, Bhagavan said it's called the heart, ulamenam, but in Sanskrit he just says hridayam. So it's in apposition. So how to meditate on it, the heart. That's implying that satyam is the heart. The heart is nothing but the one fundamental reality. And then the next sentence is, Hridi tadatma bhava stitihi jnanam satvastu naha. That means, stiti literally means standing, but it implies being or remaining or abiding. In the heart is Hridi, tadatma bhava, as it is meditating on that satvastu, jnanam satvastu naha. And then he ends with the word syat. I forgot to say in the Tamil verse, he ends with a single word, una. Una means know or be aware. In Sanskrit, he ends with a single word, syat. Syat means may you be. In other words, may you be thus. So since knowing and being are one and the same, it's in Tamil he says no, in Sanskrit he says be, but it amounts to the same. So this is a very beautiful and exact translation of a Tamil verse, and it's in the same Vemba meter. Not many people know about this, but this is this one verse composed by Bhagavan, but it's not widely known. So yes, so coming back to the Tamil verse, which means the same as the Sanskrit verse, what does he mean when he says ullate ullapadi ullade ullal, being in the heart as it is? What do you mean by ullapadi, as it is? Well, being in the heart, we can be what is the heart means what is heart means the center. So what is the so center is a relative term. There can be a center and a center of the center and a center of the center. But what Bhagavan is talking about here is the ultimate center. For example, we can say ego is the center of all our experience because ego is the experiencer. So it's only in the view of ourself as ego that everything else is experience. So the heart of all our experience is ego. But ego is the false awareness, I am this body. So the heart of ego is the pure awareness, I am. So this is the ultimate center. So if there's something other than the heart in the heart, then that thing is the heart of the heart. But in the ultimate heart, there's nothing in the heart but the heart itself. So being in the heart means being as the heart. And he emphasized that by saying ullapadi. Ullapadi means as it is. So we have to be, in other words, we have to just be that ullaporul, which is ulla unabu, the existing awareness. How to be that? Well, the truth is we are always that. But we seem to be something other than that because we've risen as ego. Therefore, the this how to be as it is in the heart is what is clarified by Bhagavan in verse 27 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. That is, being as it is what he refers to in verse 27 of Uḷḷadu as Nam Aduvai Ulla Nilai. Nam Aduvai Ulla Nilai means the state in which we are as that. Aduvai means as that or being that. So the state in which we are being that. So what is that state in which we are being that? That is what Bhagavan explains in the first sentence of verse 27 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. What he says is, Nanudiada ulla nilai, namaduvai ulla nilai. This is very, very beautifully expressed, but very, very deep in meaning. Nanudiada ulla nilai means the state in which I is without rising. That state is the state in which we are that. In other words, being without rising as ego is being as it is. So when Bhagavan says in this mangalam verse, being as it is, he means being without rising as ego. He's referring to this state, nanudiada ulla nilai, the state of just being without rising as ego. But how to be without rising as ego, that is answered by Bhagavan in the second sentence of this verse 27. He says, Nan udikum tanam ade nadamal. That means without investigating the place where I rises, nanudia tan irape savdu evan. How to reach that the destruction of oneself. In other words, how to achieve the destruction of oneself in which I does not rise. So when he talks about nanudiadu ulanile, he's not just talking about a temporary state in which ego does not rise, as in sleep, for example. Ego doesn't rise in sleep. But that's only a temporary state. He's talking about the state in which I never rises. And that is what he describes here as tanirape, the destruction of oneself. In other words, he's talking about the state of manonasa, the complete annihilation of ego. So when he says, without investigating the place where I rises, Bhagavan often uses the words that mean place. In Tamil, he usually uses the word idam, but in this case, he uses the word tanam, which is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word stanam, which means place. Though it literally means place, when he talks about the place from which I rises, he's obviously not talking about a place in time and space or a place in the body. he's using the word place metaphorically to mean the source from which I rises. So what is the source from which ego rises? It can only be from the underlying reality, the Uḻḷadu, the Uļḷadu, that which actually exists. In other words, ego rises from Atma-vichara. That is, ego is the false awareness, I am this body. That arises from the real awareness, I am. So the place where I rises is nothing but satchit, that fundamental awareness of being, I am, or being awareness, I am. So that is what we need to investigate. And this is obviously a rhetorical question. He says, without investigating that place where I rises, how to achieve that, the destruction of oneself? The implication is that we can achieve the destruction of ourself. We can achieve manonasa only by investigating our own reality, the place from which we've risen. In other words, that pure awareness I am, that is what we need to investigate. And if we don't achieve that, in the next sentence he says, Saramal tan aduam tan nilayil nipadu evan. That means without reaching. That implies if we don't reach that, the destruction of ourself, how to stand, how to be fixed in the state, in tannile. The state, tannile means the state of oneself, our real state, in which we are that. So here Bhagavan has clarified what he means by being as it is. In order to be as it is, in order to be as we actually are, we need to attend to nothing other than our own being. By attending to our being, we as ego will subside. This is what Bhagavan makes clear in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, where Bhagavan, this 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu is an extremely important verse, because here Bhagavan reveals something that, as far as I am aware, has not been explicitly explained in any ancient text. That is, Bhagavan reveals in this verse 25 what is the nature of ego. In the final line of the verse, he describes ego as Uruvatra Peya Ahande, the formless demon ego. That Uruvatra, formless, is very significant. That is, ego has no form of its own, because what ego essentially is, if you remove all adjuncts, if you remove the upadi, this body, what remains is the pure awareness I am. So ego in its essential nature, what ego essentially is, what ego actually is nothing but the pure awareness I am. We call it ego only when it's mixed and conflated with adjuncts as I am this body. So, but in its essential nature, ego is formless. But as ego, it's a demon. He describes it as a pei. A pei is a type of, it's often pei is translated as phantom, or a ghost. It's a pei is the Tamil word pei is what in Sanskrit is called pisasa. A pisasa is a type of demon that will come and possess people. So this ego has possessed us, so to speak. We are possessed by this ego. So he describes ego as a Uruvatra Peya Ahande. So ego has no form of its own. Since it has no form of its own, that means it's got no separate existence of its own. So in its original formless state, ego is nothing but pure awareness. In other words, there's no such thing as ego at all. What exists is only that Suddha Chaitanya, that Satchit, the pure being awareness, I am. So it comes into existence as ego only when it grasps form. That's what Bhagavan says in the first sentence of this verse. He begins by saying, Urupatri undam. Grasping form, it comes into existence. Sometimes this is loosely translated as, by grasping form, it comes into existence. But that's not appropriate, because it must exist in order to grasp form. So when Bhagavan says Urupatri Undam, he implies that as soon as it comes into existence, it grasps a form. But there's no form existing independent of ego, as he makes clear in the next verse 26. He says, Ahande undayan anatum undahum, ahande indrail indru anatum. That is, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Everything here refers to all phenomena, all forms. So forms do not exist independent of ego. So the implication of Urupatri Undam, as soon as ego rises, it projects and it grasps the form of a body as I. That is, in this sentence, the Uru he's referring to is the form of a body. And as Bhagavan says in verse 5 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Udal Pancha Kosa Uru, the body is a form of 5 sheaths. So he's not just referring to the physical form of the body, but the form of 5 sheaths. So the 5 sheaths are the physical form of the body, the Annamaya Kosha, the life that animates the body, the Pranamaya Kosha, the mind that operates within the body, the mind, intellect and will that operate in the body. The mind is a Manomaya Kosha, the intellect is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the will is the Vijnanamaya Kosha. That's all the vasanas that give rise to the likes, dislikes, desires, and attachments. That's what is called Chittam, or also the Anandamaya Kosha, or Karana Sarira, because that's the cause of everything else. That is, ego is the root cause, but everything else is caused by the expansion of the vasanas. So, yeah, I'm expanding the meaning here, but all he says here is Urupatri Undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. That means as soon as it rises, it projects and grasps the form as I. Urupatri Nikkam, grasping form, it stands. That is, ego cannot stand for a moment without constantly grasping the form of a body as I. So the ego is, as Bhagavan made clear, ego is nothing but this false adjunct conflated awareness, I am this body. If you remove the adjuncts, what remains is the pure awareness I am. That's why he says in verse 25 of Upadesha, knowing oneself without adjuncts is knowing God. God is God there. It implies Brahman, what the underlying reality, the Uḷḷadu. So all we have to do is to know ourselves without adjuncts, and that is knowing ourselves as we actually are. Because, as Bhagavan said, because God shines as oneself. So God is always shining as ourselves. We don't recognize God as ourselves because we have identified ourselves with a set of adjuncts. So all we need to do is to see ourselves without adjuncts. So the very nature of ego, it cannot rise without grasping form, it cannot stand without grasping form. And having grasped the form of a body as I, it doesn't stop there. It then constantly is grasping other forms, as he implies in the next sentence. Urupatri undu mika ongum, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Here, whereas the first two forms, in the first two sentences, the form he's referring to is particularly the form of the body consisting of 5 sheaths. Here, form means all phenomena. That is, throughout the waking and dream states, we are constantly attending to things other than ourselves. That is, this ego is a formless phantom. It's nothing but awareness. So how does it grasp form? It grasps in its awareness. So it grasps the form of a body by identifying it as I. And so it comes into existence and stands identifying itself as a body. And then it's constantly attending to other forms. Forms here means phenomena of any kind whatsoever. It's not just referring to physical forms, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and anything that is in any way, that has any distinguishing features. In other words, anything that is visesha in any way is a form. So grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. In other words, attention to things other than ourselves is the very food on which ego lives. And then he says, Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form it grasps form, because it cannot stand for a moment without grasping form. If it lets go of one form, it grasps another form. That can be understood moment to moment. Our attention is flitting from one thing to another thing to another thing. That's one implication of this sentence. Another meaning is when we leave one form, at the time of the death of this body, unless the ego dies, we'll let go of one form and we'll then grasp some other form as I. As we see in dream, sometimes when we fall asleep, we don't actually go directly from waking to to sleep. Sometimes we do, but generally, often we will slip from waking into a dreamlike state, and then later we'll fall. We go into deep sleep. So just like when we're leaving the body in the waking state, we then grasp the dream body like that. So leaving form, it grasps form. So from this we understand, from these four sentences, the very nature of ego is grasping form. That's why in the classical texts of Advaita, it's ego, the function of ego is described as abhimanam. The very nature of ego is to be constantly identifying itself, attaching itself to things other than itself. So what happens if instead of grasping form, supposing we as ego try to grasp ourselves? In other words, instead of attending to things other than ourselves, what happens if we try to attend to ourselves? That is what Bhagavan talks about in the next sentence. Tedinal otum pidicum. This is a very beautiful sentence. Tedinal literally means if seeking. If seeking, otum pidicum. Otum pidicum, otum means running. It's a noun meaning running. Pidicum means grasping, running. In other words, it runs away. Like in English, we say it takes flight. Takes flight means if you're in a battlefield and the enemy are stronger than you, finally you have to run away. That's called fleeing or taking flight. Taking flight doesn't mean, some people who aren't so familiar with English mean taking flight means flying. No, it doesn't mean flight here means fleeing. So taking flight is just like we say taking flight, in Tamil it said otum pidicum. It grasps running. In other words, it runs away, it disappears. Bhagavan illustrated this with various analogies, such as the best known one is the story of the bridegroom's friend, who wasn't really the bridegroom's friend at all, but who was a wayfarer who posed as the bridegroom's friend. And he had a very good time for 5 days during all the wedding celebrations until people started to inquire about who he is, and then he slipped away, he ran away. So such is the nature of this ego. Ego will be dancing around, grasping this and grasping that, until we turn back to look and see what is this ego. When we turn back to look at this ego, Manamena Mondrile, as he says in verse 17 of Upadeshundya. In verse 17, he says, verse 17 of Upadeshundya, that is, he says, Manatin uruve maravatu chava manamena mondrile undipara. That is, if we, or when we investigate the form of the mind without forgetting, that is, without pramada, without allowing our attention to be diverted away from anything else, there's no such thing as mind at all. That is, we seem to be, here, their mind, it implies ego. We seem to be ego so long as we're attending to anything else. But if we try to turn our attention back and see, who am I, this ego? There's no such thing as ego to be found. So, as Bhagavan says, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. Tedinal literally means if seeking. It doesn't say who is seeking what, but the implication is if ego seeks itself, if it seeks to know its own reality, if it seeks to know who am I, it will run away, it'll disappear. In other words, What Bhagavan explains in this verse is that the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, to forms. But if it tries, instead of attending to forms, if it tries to attend to I, who am I? To whom do all these forms of these thoughts appear? If we turn our attention back towards ourselves, this ego will subside. So this is a very, very precious truth Bhagavan has given us, because if we understand this, we will understand how that ego is the root of all problems. And in order to curb the rising of ego, all we have to do is to attend to ourselves, to turn our attention back to ourselves. To the extent to which we attend to ourselves, to that extent we as ego will subside. The more we attend to ourselves, the more we subside. And when we attend to ourselves exclusively, we dissolve forever back into our source. That's what Bhagavan implies by Tedi Nalotam Pidikam. So since the nature of ego is such, this explains why Bhagavan says in that verse 27, 2 verses later, in the second sentence, Nanudikum tanamade nadamal, nanudiya tanirape savadu evan. How to achieve the annihilation of oneself, in which I does not rise, if we do not, without investigating the place where it rises. In other words, the only way to bring about the subsidence and eventual complete destruction of ego is to attend to its source. Attending to the source of ego and attending to ego are one and the same thing, because if you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, the source of the snake is the rope. But the snake and the rope are not two different things. So whether if you look at the snake carefully, you see it's only a rope. Likewise, if we look at ego carefully, we see it's only the underlying reality, the Uḻḷadu, the Uļḷadu, the existing awareness, the real awareness, the pure awareness I am. So attending to the source of ego and attending to ego are actually one and the same thing. Bhagavan sometimes talked about tracing ego back to its source. He gave the analogy of a dog following its master's scent. That is, if we as ego turn our attention back on ourselves, we thereby subside back into our source. That is tracing ego back to its source. That is, we trace ego back to its source simply by attending to it, because by attending to it, otam pidikam, it runs away, it subsides back into its source. And that is the only way to bring about tanirape, the destruction of oneself. So what Bhagavan says in this first mangalam verse, that being in the heart as it is, in order to be in the heart as it is, we need to attend to ourselves. To the extent to which we attend to ourselves, we as ego subside. And to the extent to which we as ego subside, we remain in the state that he describes as being in the heart as it is, Uļḷate Uļḻapadi Uļḷade, or in this verse 27, as Nanudiyada Uļlanilai, the state in which I is without rising. And that is the state in which we are that. That is the state in which we are being the Uļḷapadu as it is. So all these are very beautifully, that is, Bhagavan's teachings are so clear and so coherent. If we tie all these different threads together, connect what he says in one verse with another verse, it forms such a beautiful and coherent whole. And as I say, what Bhagavan has revealed about the nature of ego, as far as I'm aware, I do not think this has been explicitly explained. It may be indirectly implied, but it's never been explicitly stated, as Bhagavan has stated it in, well, he stated it most clearly in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, but it was something Bhagavan repeatedly emphasized. But whatever problem may be, all we have to do, the root of all problems is ego. The way to deal with ego is to attend to it. To the extent to which we attend to ego, it will thereby subside. That is another story, like the story of the bridegroom's friend. Another story Bhagavan sometimes told was the story of the sadhu and the dog. That is, there was a sadhu who lived in a mandapam. It was an open mandapam, so anyone could come there. He would, once a day, he would go to a nearby village to beg his food. So he would bring the food in his begging bowl, and he would, before going to bed at night, he would eat half the food and keep the other half for the morning. But one morning when he woke up, he looked at his begging bowl and it was empty. So he decided he should find out who has come and stolen his food. So the next night he decided, when he lay down, that he would pretend to sleep, but he wouldn't sleep in order to catch the thief. But he fell asleep. He trying to keep awake, he fell asleep. And in the morning again, the food was missing. So then he was more determined. So the next night he was more vigilant. He avoided falling asleep. He kept a watchful eye. He closed his eyes, but was just listening for any sound. Slowly, slowly, he heard some soft feet approaching. He opened his eyes and looked. There was a dog. As soon as the dog saw it was being looked at, it slinked away. Then the next night also, he was being very vigilant. The dog, having been spotted once, it was more cautious this time. It came up close to the entrance of the mandapam, was peering inside, and it saw him looking at it. It slipped away. The next night it was a little further away. Finally, it just looked from a distance, and seeing him looking at it, it slipped away. As Bhagavan said, likewise with the ego, the more we look at ego, the more it will retreat, the more it will slink away like that dog. So all we have to do, if we want to curb the rising of ego, all we have to do is to be self-attentive, attend to ourselves, and this ego will slip away. Tedinal otum pidicum. Nanudikum tanamade nadama. Without attending to the place from which it arises, the source from which it arises, in other words, our own being, nan udiya taniripe savdu evan. How to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramana Jayanti.